Chapter 16. "The shops are all locked and boarded up," said the lamplighter. He propped his pole against the wall and sat down in a hammock with a heavy sigh. "And the Institute is shut up as usual. I've lit all the lamps, though I don't know what I bothered. Firefly Square is deserted." Mina was sitting on a small hammock with Tick-Tick on her lap. Edward Evesham was tinkering with an old lamp in one corner, and the Neptune sisters were examining various interesting pieces of driftwood in the other. The Camomiles climbed the ladder, each carrying a tray laden with teacups, a teapot, and a large plate of hot buttered toast, and were greeted with murmurs of approval. Hugo looked around the lighthouse's cosy sitting room. Everybody looked so comfortable and settled, and almost relieved to have left the worries and cares of Firefly Square behind. Even the lamplighter seemed cheerful, and obviously enjoying the company. The only person not happy and relieved and cheerful was Hugo himself. He let out a long, deep sigh. Everybody stopped what they were doing and looked at him. "Are you all right, Hugo, dear?" said Lily Neptune. "Not really," Hugo admitted sadly. "I mean, I'm happy that everything's worked out so well for all of you, but—" his lower lip trembled. "Yes, Hugo, darling," said Lily. "What is it?" "Well," said Hugo, turning from the small window through which he had been watching the twinkling lights of Harbour Heights, "I was just wondering how I'm ever going to get back to Harvey and Sarvey without the snow chariot. It's up on the roof of Edward Evesham's workshop, which is all locked and boarded up." He sat down next to Mina and let out another long, deep sigh. Everybody gathered round, looks of concern on their faces. "Oh, Hugo, dear," exclaimed Daisy Neptune, "we're so sorry. We've been having such a lovely time here in this wonderful lighthouse that we forgot all about you." "How thoughtless we are," said Lily, clucking with concern. "We must do something to help you." "Never fear, Hugo, my lad," said Edward Evesham. "If we all pitch in, we can sort this mess out. Now, what you need is a flash lamp, just like this one, so you can see what you're doing." He placed the lamp on Hugo's head. "That's a start at least," he said, looking around at the others. Mina got up and slipped from the room. "And you need courage and a brave heart," said Frida, passing Hugo a teacup. "And for that you must drink my new Lionheart tea," said Diego encouragingly, pouring tea from the teapot. "A grappling hook," said Lily, thrusting one into Hugo's arms. "And rope, lots and lots of rope," said Daisy brightly, gathering up a coiled armful. Everybody gazed at Hugo. Hugo tried to smile back. He knew they meant well, but he couldn't see how any of this was going to help him get into Evesham's workshop. Then Mina returned, Tick-Tick barking at her heels. "I brought you this, Hugo, darling," she said, in her musical voice, holding out a rolled-up carpet. "It is the only carpet in the world that is made of pure cloud sheep wool. My mother wove it for special occasions when only 100% pure cloud sheep wool flying carpet would do. This," she added, "is one of those occasions." Hugo swallowed hard and took the carpet. "Oh, and Hugo, darling," said Mina, smiling and slipping off her carpet slippers of unusual design, "take these as well, just to be on the safe side." Half an hour later, as the full moon rose over Harbour Heights, Hugo stepped off the balcony at the top of the Cyclops Point lighthouse and onto a gently swaying flying carpet. He sat down gingerly and pulled his toes forward as Mina had instructed him. "Just point them in the direction you want the carpet to fly," she had called encouragingly. "And remember, lean forwards for down and backwards for up. It's simple," she smiled. "Simple," said Hugo, trying to stop his knees trembling. "Your lamp," said Edward Evesham from the balcony, tapping his own forehead. "Don't forget your lamp, Hugo, my boy." Hugo flicked a switch, and the lamp attached to his head flickered into life. "Good luck," called Daisy and Lily Neptune. "Courage, Hugo lad," added Diego Camomile. "Fly safely," said Mina, letting go of the carpet, which took off instantly on a gust of wind. Before Hugo knew it, he was sailing high over the harbour towards the broad sweep of Archduke Ferdinand Boulevard. Concentrating with all his might, he pointed his toes towards the left-hand edge of the faded carpet and felt it swoop round in response. He pointed his toes straight ahead and leaned back. Instantly, the carpet rose and straightened its course. Hugo pointed his toes to the left, to the right, and back straight ahead again, leaning forwards and back and forwards again. The carpet rose, fell, darted through the air in a lurching zigzag. It was the most exhilarating feeling he had ever experienced, better even than those first moments in the snow chariot. It was, Hugo thought dreamily as he soared and swooped through the air, almost as if he could fly up and touch the moon. Just then, a sharp gust of wind made the carpet buckle alarmingly and wobble from side to side. Hugo fell back and clung to the sides as the whole carpet shot almost vertically upwards. For a moment he thought he was going to slide right off it and fall, but he forced himself to lean forwards as far as he could, and the carpet levelled off once more. Breathing heavily and with his heart beating fit to burst, Hugo looked around. Below him lay the grand squares of the heights, and not far off, in a direct line from the Cyclops Point lighthouse in the distance, lay the twinkling lights of Firefly Square. Taking a deep breath, Hugo pointed his toes straight ahead and headed for the lights. Leaning forwards, he came down low over Brimstone Alley and flew round Firefly Square in a broad arc. In front of him, the shops of the south side drew closer. He lined up Edward Evisham's workshop with the tips of his toes and, leaning back once more, aimed for the roof. With a soft swishing sound, the carpet scuffed the roof tiles and came to a skidding halt beside a huge glass skylight, which was propped open. Hugo climbed unsteadily to his feet and pattered across the roof. He looked all around, but there was no sign of the snow chariot either below in the darkened workshop or up here on the roof where it should have been sitting ready and waiting for him. Hugo glanced down, and as he did, the light of his headlamp fell on something that made his heart leap suddenly into his mouth. There, on the glass of the skylight of Evisham's workshop, was a sooty black footprint, as wide as a milk pail, with 3 long toes splayed out at the front. The footprint of a snow giant. Chapter 17. For a moment or two, Hugo couldn't believe his eyes. Everywhere he looked, there were more of the sooty footprints, lots and lots of them, big and round and 3-toed, and, for someone who had grown up in the frozen north, totally unmistakable. Snow giants, whispered Hugo, astonished. In Harbour Heights? He tiptoed across the rooftop. The footprints led to the edge of the roof. Hugo peered across the narrow gap between the roof of Evisham's workshop on the south side and the roof of the Institute on the east side, with the steps of Sleeping Horse Lane between. On the opposite side, a snow giant's footprints continued across the roof of the Institute, smeared and smudged here and there by some heavy object being pulled along behind it. "They've made off with the snow chariot," breathed Hugo. Taking the grappling hook and rope that the Neptune sisters had given him, Hugo threw it across the narrow gap of Sleeping Horse Lane. The grappling hook clattered over the ridge roof of the Institute and down the other side of the roof slope. Hugo pulled the rope taut, then clicked his heels. Silently he rose up and hovered in the air in Mina Dahl's carpet slippers of unusual design. Then, hand over hand, Hugo pulled himself across Sleeping Horse Lane and over the roof of the Institute towards the chimney stack. Clicking his heels a second time, he sank gently back down to the roof, landing beside the chimney. He peered over the roof ridge. The snow giant footprints led to a wrought iron fire escape at the back of the Institute. Hugo was just about to follow them when he heard a strange scuffling sound coming up from below. He crouched down behind the chimney stack and, at the very last moment, as the scuffling grew louder, remembered to flick his headlamp off. The next instant, with a plof sound, a sooty head appeared out of the chimney pot above Hugo's head. Plof, plof. More heads appeared from the chimney pots all around. Small, hairy creatures with long arms, short legs, and enormous feet clambered out of the chimneys one by one and padded across the roof tiles. As Hugo watched, they spread out on the roof slope facing Firefly Square and lay down. Then, one by one, But soon, in groups of 3 or 4, they raised their enormous feet to the night sky and wiggled their toes at the moon. Hugo was so astonished he almost slipped and rolled off the roof, but managed to grab hold of the chimney stack and save himself just in time. "Who'd have thought that snow giants would be so small?" he murmured to himself. For a long while the creatures lay on their backs while a cool breeze blew across the rooftops, ruffling the fur of their enormous feet. As it did so, a low hum, almost like a purr, spread through the crowd. Hugo remained very still, crouched down behind the chimney stack. It was late now, and what with the humming of the creatures and the gentle hypnotic sway of their feet, he was beginning to feel a little drowsy. But just as he felt his eyelids growing heavy and his head beginning to nod, something happened that made him sit bolt upright, suddenly wide awake. The unmistakable figure of Elliot DeMille, director of the Institute, stepped off the fire escape and strode across the roof. He was wearing an expensive-looking silk dressing gown, slippers of a rather ordinary design, and a look of smug self-satisfaction on his face. When he saw the creatures, he tutted with irritation and clicked his fingers. "Can't one have even a moment to oneself?" he snapped. "Bedtime. Lights out in 5 minutes." The contented hum became a low moan as the creatures got to their feet and started shuffling towards the chimney stacks. Elliot DeMille turned his back on them and stared out across Firefly Square. A plump pigeon appeared and landed on the low wall in front of him. Elliot DeMille took the message from its leg and read it. "Of course, Cressida," he whispered with a smirk. "I shall come right away." Hugo shrank back behind the chimney stack as the creatures disappeared down the chimneys. Ploff, ploff, ploff. "I said 5 minutes," barked Elliot, without turning round. The last creature clambered up onto the chimney stack and disappeared into the chimney pot. Hugo hesitated for a moment. Then, with a last glance at the hunched, silk-gowned back of the director of the Institute, he clicked the heels of Mina's carpet slippers and rose in the air to the top of the chimney. Carefully positioning himself directly over the chimney pot, Hugo took a deep breath, clicked his heels again, and with a soft, sooty ploff of his own, slowly disappeared down inside the chimney. Chapter 18. Hugo gently descended the chimney until his feet touched the fireplace at the bottom. Slowly he dropped to his knees and peered out into a vast room. It was full of small beds, the size of babies' cots, and arranged in neat lines that stretched into the distance. High above, at the centre of the ceiling, a single enormous light bulb gave off a faint flickering light. The small hairy creatures were climbing into the tiny beds and pulling the covers over themselves with long thin arms. At the bottom of each bed, 2 enormous feet stuck out. Hugo remained crouching in the shadows of the fireplace while the creatures settled. Then, when the last one had climbed into bed, a tiny, furry figure with especially enormous feet appeared and made her way along the ranks of the tiny beds. Hugo watched as the Snow Woman stopped and kissed every one of her 200 sons good night on their furry foreheads, before turning and quietly padding out of the dormitory and turning out the light. Hugo hesitated. Somewhere in the Institute was the snow chariot, and he was determined to find it. He was just about to start creeping through the dormitory when a glow appeared in the distance. The snowmen all sat up in bed as a figure with a lamp emerged from the shadows at the far end and made his way slowly to the middle of the vast room. There it produced a cushion, sat down the lamp, and settled on the floor. The snowmen crept silently out of their beds and gathered round the figure of an old man with a long flowing beard and a knitted nightshirt. When the little creatures had all sat themselves down, the old man looked round at their expectant furry faces and cleared his throat. "Once upon a time," he began, and a contented hum rose through the ranks of the listening snowmen. Hugo settled down to listen too. The story was about the North Wind and his daughter, the Ice Princess, and a young reindeer herder who fell in love with her and melted her heart. The North Wind was angry and blew the reindeer herder far from his home in the frozen north. Hugo swallowed hard and bit his lip. He had heard this story many times before. It was a story that reindeer herders told their children in front of warm stoves in little cabins deep in the ice forests as the chill north wind blew outside. It was a story that Harvey and Sarvey used to tell him on long winter nights beneath the ice moon. Hugo's eyes filled with tears. The young reindeer herder battled through all sorts of dangers and obstacles that the north wind put in his way. As the old man told the story, the snowmen gasped and hummed, they swayed when the north wind blew and trembled when the icebergs clashed. Finally, the reindeer herder arrived back at his home in the frozen north, only to find that the Ice Princess had melted away in her sorrow at losing her beloved. The reindeer herder began to weep, and such was his grief that he filled a bucket with his tears. The north wind flew into a terrible rage when he discovered that the reindeer herder had returned, and blew himself in a great storm and disappeared over the horizon. Hugo wiped away a tear of his own and smiled. When the reindeer herder woke up, the bucket of tears had become an ice forest, and the Ice Princess was waiting for him. The listening snowmen swayed and shivered and hummed with pleasure as the old man brought his story to a close, picked up the lamp and got to his feet. The snowmen shuffled to their beds, climbed in and pulled the covers back over their furry heads. "Good night, you sons of ice and snow," whispered the old man as he tiptoed quietly out of the dormitory. 200 soft, snowy snores filled the air as Hugo slipped out of the shadows of the fireplace and tiptoed after him. Chapter 19. Hugo followed the old man with the lamp down a long dark corridor, around a corner, down 3 flights of stairs, and into the basement of the institute. The old man opened a door with a glass front and went inside, closing the door quietly behind him. Hugo looked around. The basement was full of large, neat stacks of the Firefly Quarterly. Hugo reached out and took a copy from the nearest pile. He looked at the cover. It was plain and ordinary looking. It said, "The Firefly Quarterly," in big letters, "issue number 99," in smaller ones. Underneath were the words, "Editor, Elliot DeMille." Above, a smaller picture of a big toe. At the bottom of the cover it said in small, sinister letters, "Dipping a toe into the murky waters of Harbour Heights." Hugo shuddered and put the magazine down. No wonder nobody liked the Firefly Quarterly, he thought bitterly. It was full of nasty stories, stolen stories, stories that had been twisted out of shape and turned bad. Hugo looked at the neat stacks in the basement of the institute and shook his head sadly. The Firefly Quarterly was an ugly, spiteful publication. He tiptoed to the far end of the dark basement and stopped outside the door. Set into the upper panel was a pane of frosted glass with the words, "Wilfred Macpherson, Editor," painted in neat gold letters on it. Hugo hesitated for a moment, then reached out, knocked twice on the door, and opened it. "Cressida, you've done wonders with the place," exclaimed Elliot DeMille, walking round the empty shop that had once been Neptune's nautical antiques. "Mostly junk, of course, but Pingle, Duff and Pingle were happy to take it off my hands," laughed Cressida, "and pay me a pretty penny for it." "I should think so, Cressida," said Elliot, pulling up an empty tea-chest and sitting down beside the old woman. "After all, I've got plenty of secrets Mr. Pingle doesn't want his brothers or Mr. Duff to find out." They both gave cackling laughs. "Cleared the other shops too," said Cressida. "The cats love the carpet shop, and the pigeons are roosting in the workshop, and I've got enough tea to last me a lifetime, Elfie. Talking of which—" The old woman picked up a teapot with an anchor on its lid and poured tea into the cups on the tea-chest between them. "How about a nice cup of Camomile's teardrop tea?" Elliot raised his teacup triumphantly. "Here's to a bright future," he said with a thin smile. full of other people's secrets. Hugo stepped into the room. It was lined with shelves, hundreds of them, all piled high with copies of the Firefly Quarterly. But these weren't like the neat stacks in the basement outside. No, these were in untidy heaps, some spread out on the floor, others piled high beside them or slotted into the crowded shelves. They had crumpled pages with torn corners and frayed edges, as if they'd been pored over and read many times. But it was the covers that caught Hugo's eye. They had colourful pictures on them, of flying carpets, blue monkeys, snow giants and exotic birds, and the titles that promised of the wonderful stories to be found within. Fables, yarns, myths, tales. These magazines were nothing like the ugly ones outside. Hugo could tell just by looking at them that these copies of the Firefly Quarterly were beautiful. "We have a visitor, old friend," came a voice. Hugo looked up from the quarterlies at his feet. There, at a small cluttered desk full of paper and pens and inks and brushes, with a small snowman on his knee, was Wilfred Macpherson, the famous story collector. Hugo smiled. "My name's Hugo Pepper," he said, "and I have a story for you." "Scrubbing floors, polishing silver, sweeping carpets," whimpered Cresta Claw, tears streaming down her face and her soggy whiskers quivering. "No wonder I turned to snooping, Elfie love. I didn't want to," she wailed, and took another slurp of her teacup, "but they drove me to it." "That horrible bicycle," snivered Elliot DeMille. "Of course they were going to make fun of me. I mean, wouldn't you, Cressida?" He wept bitterly, pouring himself another cupful from the teapot. "If you saw a butcher's boy on a bicycle with one large wheel and one silly, ridiculous, tiddly, teeny-weeny wheel..." Elliot threw his head back and howled with tears of hurt and self-pity. "I never stood a chance." "It was the not knowing that was the hardest part," said Wilfred Macpherson, smiling at Hugo and drying his eyes on a large handkerchief. "Of course, I suspected that something terrible had happened. I could hardly bear it. I lost interest in everything and shut myself up here in my study and lost myself in my beloved stories." He shook his head sadly and patted the snowman's furry shoulder. "Oh, what a stupid, self-pitying old man I've been. I allowed that rascal Elliot DeMille to take over the Institute and bully you and your children into printing that awful quarterly of his, didn't I?" The snowman looked up into the story collector's grief-stricken face and patted his hand. He mumbled softly. "I know you only did it for me, old friend. It makes me feel terrible, because I was so wrapped up in my own misery, I just didn't care. What did I have to live for, with Phillida and Phineas and their beautiful baby, lost forever?" Wilfred turned back to Hugo with glistening eyes. "And now you, Hugo, my handsome young grandson, have come back to me. It's like waking up from a long, sad, terrible dream. Thank you, Hugo, for telling me your story. You've made a foolish old story collector very happy." He got to his feet and took his grandson by the hand. "Now, you must go, Hugo, my boy. Leave at once. The Institute is no place for you. Elliot DeMille has poisoned it. It means so much to me that you've come back to Harbour Heights, Hugo. But of course I understand that this is not your home. Go back to Harvey and Sarvey in the frozen north with my blessing." The storyteller turned to the little snowman and ruffled the hair on his furry head. "Ranulph here will take you to the snow chariot. Fionnuala and he recognised it as a Crane & Sons Aeronautical Snow Chariot Mark II, the moment they saw it on the roof of Evesham's workshop." He smiled sadly. "And brought it to me. They thought it might cheer me up. Go now, Hugo, my boy, before Elliot DeMille returns." But Hugo shook his head, his bright, clear blue eyes flashing with defiance. Reaching out, he seized a copy of the beautiful Firefly Quarterly and held it up to his grandfather. "This story isn't over," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "And we have all night to give it a happy ending. Elliot DeMille dried his eyes with his expensive-looking silk handkerchief and got up. "I feel much better for that," he said, with a thin smile. "I can't tell you how good it feels not having to skulk around the square for fear of being recognised any more." "It's no more than you deserve, Elfie, love," said Cressida Claw, her whiskers quivering moistly. Elliot put on his expensive-looking black overcoat and large silk hat, and was just stepping out of the shop that used to be Neptune's Nautical Antiques when he stopped, a look of surprise on his thin, mean-looking face. Across Firefly Square, the windows of the Institute were all lit up. Leaving Cressida Claw looking tearfully after him, Elliot DeMille strode towards the Institute, his large silver key in his gloved hand of duck-egg blue. He reached the door and hurriedly put the key in the lock, turned and pushed. But the door wouldn't budge. Elliot DeMille's eyes blazed with anger as he beat on the door of the Institute with fists of duck-egg blue. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared. "Let me in! Let me in!" Chapter 20. Elliot DeMille sat on the doorstep of the Institute with his head in his hands. He had spent all night trying to get inside. He had hammered on the door and shouted until his throat was hoarse. He had tried to force open the shuttered windows and ruined his duck-egg blue gloves. The fire escape had been pulled up and the back doors locked. Now, as the first rays of dawn were breaking over Firefly Square, he was just about ready to give up. The trouble was, Elliot realised, he had made the Institute just too secure during his time as director, bolting the door and shuttering the windows, and now here he was, locked out himself. All night, the lights inside the Institute had blazed, and Elliot had heard a sound that filled him with dread. The clackety-clack of the printing presses going at full pelt. Now, as dawn broke, the Institute had fallen ominously quiet. What could it all mean? Wondered Elliot DeMille, twisting his silk hat in his hands. Just then, a curious stuttering sound started up from the rooftop of the Institute above. Fut, 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 bang, fut. Elliot looked up, and his mouth fell open with astonishment. There, sailing up into the dawn sky, was an extraordinary contraption, a sort of cross between a sled and a hot air balloon. Behind it, attached by a rope, the contraption towed a faded-looking carpet. This was all very curious, and yet, to Elliot DeMille, it was not the most astonishing thing about the sight. No, the most astonishing thing to Elliot was the sight of Wilfred Macpherson, a small boy, and a crowd of snowmen on board, seated next to piles and piles of what could only be Firefly Quarterly magazines. Elliot gulped like a stranded goldfish as the snowmen each took a bundle of the journals and threw them into the air. The contraption disappeared over the rooftops of Brimstone Alley, heading for the grand squares of Harbour Heights. A moment later, one of the magazines fluttered down and landed at Elliot's feet. He picked it up with trembling hands and looked at the cover. "Great stories are back," he read, before opening the quarterly and looking at the first page. There, in large letters, was a title that left him trembling from head to toe. "The Sad Tale of Elfie Spangle, the Butcher's Boy," he read. Once upon a time there was a butcher's boy called Elfie Spangle. Elliot DeMille dropped the quarterly, threw back his head, and howled, "No!" High above Harbour Heights, the snow chariot sailed, towing the flying carpet behind it, and everywhere it flew, from the grand squares of the heights to the alleyways and warehouses of the lower town, copies of the new Firefly Quarterly came fluttering down to earth. There, the people of Harbour Heights picked them up as they went about their business. Soon there were groups of people from Montmorency Square to Pudding Bowl Row, reading and giggling and laughing out loud. Not all of them were so happy. Bernard Bumble, the meat pie magnate, wasn't pleased to read about how Elliot DeMille had discovered that his buns were full of sawdust. And at Pingle, Pingle, Duff and Pingle, the bailiffs, a nasty fight broke out. In fact, there were many in the bustling city of Harbour Heights who would have cheerfully wrung the director of the Institute's neck if only they could have found him. But they couldn't, for he and his accomplice, Cresta Claw, had vanished. There was, however, one thing that all the residents of Harbour Heights could happily agree on. The new Firefly Quarterly was a great improvement on the old one. As the moon rose over Firefly Square, the snow chariot came in to land in the gardens, where a small reception committee had gathered. The lamplighter, Daisy and Lily Neptune, Mina Dahl, Edward Evesham, and the Camomiles broke into delighted applause as the skis of the chariot touched down on the grass, and Wilfred Macpherson and Hugo climbed out. Behind them, small, furry snowmen with enormous feet tumbled head over heels as the flying carpet glided down to earth. "I'm delighted to see you all," said the old story collector, shaking each of the small group by the hand. "I'm so sorry I allowed things to go so wrong." "Oh, Wilfred," trilled Daisy and Lily Neptune, embracing him. "It's just so lovely to see you again. That nasty Elliot DeMille spread the news that you'd retired to the sunny south." "Now we can get back to the way things were," said Edward Evesham. "Things can never be quite the way they were," said Mina sadly, thinking of her best friend. "But at least now Hugo can return to Harvey and Sarvey in the frozen north." Hugo smiled. "And we've all seen the last of Elliot DeMille," said Diego Camomile. "Cleared out of Firefly Square this morning, but not before clearing out all our shops of everything we own. All he left was a dirty teacup." He pointed to a chipped cup with an anchor design on it, which his wife Frida was holding. "Teardrop tea by the look of it," she said, before giving a little ladylike shriek. "Oh, Diego, I see it again." "See what?" said Daisy and Lily Neptune, gathering round as Frida gazed into the bottom of the teacup. "I see a one-eyed giant," she said, "staring at a one-eared cat, pointing the way to the seabed's treasure." "One-eyed giant?" said Daisy. "One-eared cat?" said Lily. "Seabed's treasure?" said Hugo excitedly. "I think I might know what that means." A little while later, a flying carpet, ridden by a young woman with a moth dog on her lap, dropped an old lamplighter and a mechanical wizard off at the top of the old lighthouse at Cyclops Point and flew off. Back in the gardens of Firefly Square, an extraordinary collection of people waited by the old fountain with the statue of a one-eared cat holding a curled scroll in its paws. There was the stooped old story collector with a careworn face and sad eyes. There were the little furry snowmen, the toes of their enormous feet tapping with barely concealed anticipation, and the tall, elegant mermaids whose tails tapped also beneath the silken folds of their long walk suits. Beside them, the tea-blenders from the sunny south stood arm in arm, their eyes fixed on the Cyclops Point lighthouse in the distance. The small boy, dressed in the costume of a reindeer herder from the frozen north, and clutching a large shovel, turned and gave them all a dazzling smile. The next moment, the great lamp at the top of the lighthouse burst into life for the first time in many, many years. All over Harbour Heights, people leaned over balconies or peered from open windows or looked up from their copies of the Firefly Quarterly as they sat in cafes or on park benches. High over the rooftops of Montmorency Square and Clifftop Row, of Archduke Ferdinand Boulevard and Harbour Side, of Sleeping Horse Lane and Brimstone Alley, the one-eyed giant sent its dazzling beam of light. Down it shone, cutting through the darkening sky from the distant lighthouse, directly into the small, overgrown gardens at the centre of Firefly Square. There, the beam of light struck the curled bronze scroll held in the claws of the one-eared cat that perched on top of the old disused fountain. Bouncing off it, the light shot across the garden like a glowing finger pointing the way. It fell on a patchy piece of grass directly beneath a tall spreading tree in the corner of the gardens, the very tree that Hugo Pepper had landed in just a few short days before. Hugo rushed to the spot and began to dig. A few moments later, the edge of his shovel hit something hard and metallic, something like a very, very large treasure chest. Clink. Epilogue. From the Montmorency Gazette. Firefly feline shines on piratical plunder. From our own correspondent. Amid amazing scenes last night, the mythical treasure of the notorious pirate Brimstone Kate was finally unearthed by an enterprising visitor from the frozen north. Hugo Pepper, 12, said yesterday, "Treasure hunting is just my cup of tea." For years, treasure hunters have searched Harbour Heights, digging up Arthur Bluntstone's blacksmith shop and looking beneath the cat fountain in Firefly Square. But it was only when Hugo Pepper had the bright idea of firing up the old Cyclops Point lighthouse that a fresh light was shone on the problem. The statue of Brimstone Kate's cat reflected the beam of light directly on the spot where the pirate had hidden her plunder. The grateful Harbour Board have rewarded the young reindeer herder with half the 2022 gold Dandoon doubloons, which the young treasure hunter intends to use to commemorate his parents, who were tragically eaten by polar bears. From Harbour High Society magazine. Seagull About Town. Statue honours the memory of the Peppers of Firefly Square. A new statue was unveiled in Firefly Square of the brave young story collectors Phineas and Phillida Pepper by their son, Hugo, 11 years after they were tragically eaten by polar bears in the frozen north. Their story has since become famous as the basis for the musical drama The Peppers of Firefly Square. From the Harbour Heights Grocer. The Harbour Heights Grocer. After the shock news of the collapse of Bernard Bumble's meat pie empire, the grocer is happy to report some good news. World-renowned cheesemakers of the frozen north, Harvey and Sarvey Runtatun, are opening a cheese shop in our fair city. Runtatun's Ranger Cheese of Firefly Square. Turn right, out of Sleeping Horse Lane, first shop on the east side. The Runtatuns intend to spend the winters in Harbour Heights selling the cheese they make all summer in their little cabin in the ice forests of the frozen north. The shopkeepers of Firefly Square told the grocer, "We're delighted to welcome the Runtatuns to our little family." From the school magazine of the school ship, Betty Jean. The Scowling Mermaid, Summer Term. We are pleased to welcome Hugo Pepper, grandson of Wilfred Macpherson of the Institute of Travellers' Tales, to our school this term. Hugo has recently returned from the frozen north with Harvey and Sarvey Runtatun, the famous cheesemakers. Head girl, Corby Flood, said, "Hugo has quite a story to tell." Message received by Flying Box by Edward Evesham of Evesham's Workshop. Dear Edward, I need your help. I'm coming to see you in Firefly Square. Your old friend, Theo Crane.
Shoulder bone shake hold and take hold. Somebody should take you home. Let's add light to the side and put aside. But nothing's gonna catch your